Okay, good morning, people. How you doing this morning? Let's see who's here. Aliana's here, and she's a smiley face, so that's good. Oh no, she's also a sleepy face. Um, Lim is here. Good morning to you. Who else is here? Cindy's here, and hopefully she's a happy face. Min is here. Good morning, Min. Jenna has no mouth this morning. I don't know what that emoji means, but okay. Um, Lim is feeling good, I think. Ying is feeling okay, I hope. Good morning, Ying. Lily's here. Good morning, Lily. Min's feeling good. Masheed's feeling good, I hope. Good morning, Masheed. Good morning, Karen again. Good morning, KC again. So we'll just wait another minute or so for people to trickle in. Today, what we'll do is we'll talk about the mummification video that we watched at the end of class yesterday. We'll talk about those questions. We'll answer them. We will. I'll talk a little bit about Egyptian art, and then we'll have a bit of a kind of brainstorming session, I guess, to figure out how we can best summarize ancient Egypt. How can we think about the most important things that we learned about ancient Egyptian culture? Okay, so we'll do that toward the end. So kind of three things that we need to do. Adalbert's here. Good morning, Adalbert. Okay, we got 11 people, I think, but we'll dive in. Okay. So yesterday we watched the video because we were talking about the Egyptians' view of the afterlife. Hello, Thika again. And Ella. Hello, Ella. We were talking about the Egyptian afterlife because it actually plays a pretty big part in their conception of religion and conception of the universe, right? We see that a lot of the archaeological material that the Egyptians have left us actually has to do with burial and with mummification, because again, the entrance to the afterlife was an important part, idea for ancient Egyptians. Good morning, Carmen. And good morning, Luan. So again, the Egyptians buried their dead in a very elaborate fashion, right? And the point was to preserve the body as best as possible, right? Because the two parts of the spirit, the Ba and the Ka, would unite, and they would actually need to recognize the physical body, the dead body, in order to enter it. And so, again, Egyptians went to great lengths to try to make sure that the people were preserved in their for the afterlife. And so, again, initially only kings were mummified. It was a very secretive and difficult and expensive process. But as time went on in ancient Egypt, more and more people started to mummify their dead as well. So the pharaoh was an influencer, and people started to follow them. Again, we don't know. There's no real written record of exactly what the mummification process was, but scientists have a significant number of Egyptian mummies to study, and so they're able to have some idea about what the ancient Egyptians were doing. So I'm just going to jump ahead a couple of slides here, and we'll go to the questions from the mummification video. So the first question I asked you, and this might be a little tricky, is what is mat or ma'at? What did they say that was? This might have been a little tricky to get from the video, but what is this thing? Okay, so Michael says mat is peace. Thika says The Egyptian universe is controlled by a goddess who governs the world and the heaven and Ra and sun. Even the sun god obeys the laws of Ma'at. Okay. No problem, Michael. Glad you're here. Okay, so both of those are partially correct. So the idea that Ma'at is peace, and that the universe is controlled by this thing, and even the sun god, even the greatest of gods, has to obey Ma'at. Do you have anything else for that one? Aliana says, Ma'at is a religion, not sure, it's a guess. Well, it's definitely a part of religion, and a part of the way that the Egyptians understand the universe to work. That's definitely true, Aliana. Ellis, it's like the social order. Okay. What else? We're circling around it. We're getting pieces of it, that's for sure. To be honest, I asked you this question because I don't think the video did a very good job explaining what it was, but that's okay. So we've got a few things here, and part of it has to do with peace, part of it has to do with a part of religion, which is true, part of it has to do with the social order, which is also true, and it's something that controls the universe. And so what, and Carmen says that a goddess. Oh, here we go. A goddess of truth and justice. Yeah. So sometimes Ma'at is thought of as a goddess. Sometimes Ma'at is portrayed as a goddess, as a woman. And one of the reasons for that is because what Ma'at is actually not necessarily a god, but a universal order. Okay. And so it has to do, like Michael had said, you said it had to do with peace, and it does have to do with peace. It does have to do with order and justice and balance and kind of this universal feeling of how the world operates. And so, of course, all the gods have to follow this because it's kind of the law of the universe. It's kind of the way that the universe works. The universe works according to Ma'at, this universal feeling of balance and order. Okay, and so she's not necessarily a goddess, but again, if you're drawing on a tomb wall, I mean, how do you draw a universal order of balance, right? It's a very abstract concept, and so in order to symbolize it, talked about how culture is symbolic. In order to symbolize it, sometimes the Egyptians would portray Ma'at as a woman. The other way that we see it portrayed, and I think you may have seen it in the video, was as kind of a feather. Okay, and so a single feather is also symbolic of Ma'at, and it's this universal principle or idea of balance and order. So yeah, we kind of, I think we kind of got there, but again, the film didn't do a perfect job of explaining, I think, what that thing is. Okay, so it's a universal principle of balance and order and harmony and peace. Okay, so how were the dead judged before they entered the afterlife? And so they talked about that. The dead person enters the underworld, and what happens? So Cindy says, if you have done evil, your heart will be heavy, and so it'll tip the scales, and then your heart is devoured, right? If you've been truthful and righteous, then your heart will be feather light, and your soul will fly to paradise and re-enter your body. The hearts of the dead are placed on the scales of justice, and if they're honest and upright, then they go to heaven. Yeah, they weigh the heart. Good. The heart is weighed against the feather. Yeah, and it's a feather of truth, right? And so we saw actually we saw that happening just a few slides back here, right? We saw that happening in the bottom corner where the scales of truth here are being operated by Anubis. Anubis is on one knee there. He's balancing the scale. We can see that crocodile monster sitting there waiting to devour the heart if it happens to be heavy and evil. And again, on the far, far left, you can see Tot, who is a scribe. He's the god of writing. And he's going to record the verdict. He's going to write down what happens. Yeah, so that's how the dead are judged. And so the entrance to the afterlife is kind of, there are all sorts of trials that you have to go through, and that's part of what the Book of the Dead actually is. The Book of the Dead teaches you how to get through the underworld, where to go, certain spells you might need, certain answers to riddles, what to say to certain gods if you meet them. All of those things are within the Book of the Dead, and there's sort of like a, if you've ever traveled and you've gotten one of those guidebooks, it's kind of like a guidebook to the underworld, and it helps you to successfully make your way to the afterlife. Okay, so how did Egyptians mummify their dead? What kind of things were done to the body to preserve them? Okay, so this is an answer to the last question, but I'll put it up here. So Albert says the god of the dead, that's Anubis, performs the weighing of the heart ceremony to judge whether the person is, whether their earthly deeds were virtuous or not. Yes, definitely. Definitely the case. Okay, mummification of the dead. So Cindy says that they were naturally dried by burial in the hot desert sand. So that's kind of how mummification starts. And so if you imagine thousands of years ago, before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, before Egypt becomes sort of a complex civilization, people would have been buried in the desert, right? People would have died. You probably would have dug a grave for them and put them in, covered them over with sand, maybe put a little monument there, and then left them, right? And so in that environment, people would dry out on their own. People would mummify on their own because, again, we know Egypt is very hot, it's very dry, and when you bury people in the sand, it tends to suck the moisture out of them, and they will mummify naturally on their own. And so the Egyptians, I think, kind of get the idea from that because, again, if you bury people in a very hot, dry environment, that will happen to the body anyway. It's just too hot and dry for bacteria, and so the body just kind of dries out. But again, as time went on, Egyptians began to develop their own way of artificially mummifying people so that they could be put into a tomb. They could be put into sort of a coffin and buried in a tomb. So Cindy says it's a 35-day process. Yeah, it takes a long time. The first thing they do is they remove their organs. This is kind of gross, but internal organs tend to rot very quickly in a body. And so if you don't want a body to rot, you have to get the internal organs out. And so the Egyptians would cut open the dead person and reach in and pull out all of their internal organs except their heart, right? They said the heart was the seat of consciousness, and so the thing that makes you conscious is your heart, and so Egyptians left the person's heart in their body, but everything else comes out: the lungs, the intestines, the liver, the kidneys. All of those things are pulled out. And so all of the organs are pulled out. They stuff the insides with sort of bandages and things to help dry it out. They add herbs to sort of make it smell good and also to help the drying process. And as Karen mentions here, the organs are stored in jars. And so there's a series of little jars, and they have little animal heads on the top of them. And so there's an Anubis head and sort of a baboon head, and I think a lion head and maybe a few others. And all of the internal organs go in there. So where are we here? Okay, Thika says, yeah, they dried the body and mummified it with natural ingredients. Yeah, because there are no non-natural ingredients thousands of years ago. Um, and yeah, the skin stays, but the organs, the internal organs, and the heart remains in the body. I don't think they mentioned in the video, but one of the interesting things that happened is that the ancient Egyptians removed the brains of dead people, and interestingly, the ancient Egyptians didn't really know what the brain was for. They didn't really know what it was doing up there, and so they would put a stick and they would kind of stab it into the person's brain and kind of swirl the stick around to slush up your brain and then drain it out through your nose, and then they just throw it away, which is A, really gross, but B, it's interesting. They didn't really conceptualize the brain as kind of the seat of your consciousness and intelligence. They kind of imagine those things to come from your internal organs, and so they preserve the internal organs, and they interestingly they threw your brain out. It's kind of gross. What else do we have here? Carmen says, oh yeah, so then they dry the body, they cover it for 35 days. And so you saw in the video, I wish they would have spent more time on this, but the scientist they were talking to actually mummified a body on his own. And so somebody donated their body to science, and he and some other scientists attempted to mummify it the way that ancient Egyptians did. And so they buried this body in natron, which is a salt, and bicarbonate, I think. And so they just bury it in this sort of salty, drying compound. And again, they leave it for 35 or 40 days. And so that sucks all of the moisture out of the body. And then when they remove all of that stuff, the body is kind of perfectly dry. And then it gets sort of covered in oil. They use wax. They start to wrap the body in the sort of linen bandages that we've seen. There's lots of rituals that go on and prayers that are said. Different little charms and amulets are put onto the body in different places. And so it's actually quite a long process, preserving the body and getting it ready for burial, right? Right. So then they talk about DNA evidence, and so the idea is that these scientists were interested in extracting DNA from these mummies to learn things. And what did they want to learn? And so Cindy says it tells us. Right. So the scientist who had mummified that modern body, they were going to sample it in various places and see where is the best place to extract DNA from. Extracting ancient DNA is not an easy situation, right? Because DNA is organic and it's quite fragile. And so once something dies and starts to decompose, those little chemical strands of DNA start to come apart and dissolve. And sometimes, depending on how old the living thing was and depending on how they were preserved, sometimes you can extract usable DNA from it and sometimes you can't. And so part of what we see them doing in that study is taking that modern mummy that they created, sampling it for DNA all over to see where the best place is to find DNA in an ancient mummy. Yeah, so that's part of what's happening. And so they do that, but they also want to find out, maybe what are some of the diseases that these people were dealing with. Cause of death and age. Yes, Karen, but usually in many cases you can't tell that genetically. So age is not coded for genetically. You might be able to tell their cause of death from their DNA if they had a genetic disease. The genes would tell you that, and then you might be able to make a guess about that. You can tell their age based on other issues or other data, particularly their their skeleton. Their skeleton can help you, if you're able to look at it, maybe with an MRI machine, you're able to make a guess about how old they are. Fortunately, we also have a lot of written records from ancient Egypt as well. And so if you're dealing with the mummy of a famous pharaoh, so if you're looking at Ramses II's mummy, you can not only look at his body and get data from that, but you can also compare it to historical data, right? You can compare it to the written records we have of this person and see how those two things compare. So those are good. Oh yeah, the researchers are looking for evidence of malaria, and so were people in the past more or less adapted to resisting malaria, right? So there's that. So age has come up again. I wonder if I missed something in that video. As far as I'm aware, if you want to find an age of a dead person or a dead thing, you can radiocarbon date it, which tells you how long it's been since the person died, and then you can use other examination of the body to try to determine whether you're looking at a child or an adolescent or an adult or an older adult. I'm not sure if the DNA can tell us that. I know you can look at telomere length, but I don't think that was mentioned. I might have to look at the video again on that. So because age has come up, Ella mentions it here, and Karen has mentioned it, and so I'm drawing a blank on exactly what they talked about, but maybe I'm wrong. It's okay, Pearly, hello. Sam says, yeah, deadly diseases, okay, good. And Thika, many ancient Egyptians suffered from malaria, and so their DNA, yeah, so DNA evidence might help us to get a better idea of how malaria works and how we might be able to keep people from contracting it today. Yeah, that's good. Let's talk about this guy. Let's talk about Ramses II. What do we learn about Ramses II? He's kind of a big deal in ancient Egypt. He's a New Kingdom pharaoh. Cindy says he was viewed by Egypt as a god. Yes, definitely. He's a pharaoh. Responsible for the divine order in the universe. Yep, all pharaohs are responsible for that, and Ramses was no exception. Oh yeah, he signed the oldest known peace treaty. Yeah, that's pretty interesting, right? Our first evidence of a peace treaty is one created and signed by Ramses, right? Yeah, he built a huge number of temples all throughout Egypt. What else do we know about him? Built many temples, yeah, and signed the oldest peace treaty. That's good. What else do we learn about him? Those are probably the most important things. There might be some others too. I just don't want to discourage people from answering. One of the things they mentioned in the film is that he is thought to be the pharaoh in the Bible. So if you know your Bible stories, and if you know the story of Moses, who leads the Israelites out of Egypt after he kind of threatens the pharaoh with a bunch of plagues, that's Ramses II that he's threatening, as far as I'm aware anyway. Carmen says he's the third pharaoh in the 19th dynasty of Egypt. Yeah, he's a New Kingdom pharaoh. We know that. Led the Egyptians' army against many enemies, including the Syrians and the Nubians. Yeah, Ramses was part of a period of Egyptian history where the Egyptians are kind of taking over various parts of the world, and so Ramses is very successful in that regard, and he conquers areas beyond Egypt. His whole family was involved in kingship. That's probably true. I don't exactly remember what the video said about that. But he is, as far as I'm aware, he's part of a period of history where there's sort of clean succession in terms of pharaohs. And so Ramses' father is Seti the First, and so he sort of becomes king after his father dies. And I'm reasonably certain that Ramses' son becomes pharaoh after him, and I'm not sure if he's another Ramses or if he's Tutmos. I'm not really sure, but he is part of a period in which transition of the office of pharaoh from father to son is fairly smooth. So he's part of that. Why did pharaohs stop being buried in pyramids? Why did they not want to be buried in pyramids anymore? Why did pharaohs? Karen says tomb raiding. Yeah, and not the cool kind with Lara Croft, right? We see in the video that the tombs of pharaohs and of other sort of wealthy people were robbed all the time, right? And particularly, what was the problem with pyramids, though? Why were people raiding them? Pika says, because they went through many difficult years after heavy rain. Okay, so there might have been an economic issue as well, right? The pyramids take a lot of resources to build, right? And so maybe there were other things that the pharaohs thought that those resources should be used for, right? There is something else, though. There is something else, I think. Less quantity, sheer resources it took to build. Yeah, I think that's probably part of it, right? It's probably there was the resources that it would have taken to build pyramids were diverted to other places. No, they weren't. They weren't crashing down. They were all fairly well built. What happens? What happens is that again they're being raided, and the problem with a pyramid is it's very obvious that it is there, right? You know where the pharaoh is buried when there's a gigantic pyramid sitting on top of it, right? And so it was almost like, a giant neon sign to tomb robbers saying, hey, this is where the pharaoh is buried with all of his wealth. And so again, that became kind of an irresistible temptation for people. They would break in and they would steal all of the riches. And so really all of the tombs from ancient Egypt were robbed, and most of them were robbed in antiquity. And so they were robbed thousands of years ago. And so what we see is by the time we get to the New Kingdom, and we're dealing with pharaohs like Ramses, they've moved their burial location to a place called the Valley of the Kings. And so it's kind of a narrow canyon, and they dug underground tombs, the pharaohs did. They were buried in there, and then they were kind of covered over with dirt and rocks in such a way that you could never really tell where the tomb was. The valley was guarded all the time by, Valley of the Kings guards. And so the intention there is that to bury these guys away secretly so that nobody would break into their tombs and steal all their riches. Spoiler alert, it happened anyway. All of those tombs were robbed as well, except for the tomb of Tutankhamun, who you may have heard about. And then finally, the last part. It wasn't. All the stuff got stolen because it wasn't really a secret, right? If you have a big pyramid, it's not a secret where this stuff is. It wasn't really a secret about where the stuff was, right? So how did how did how did so many royal mummies come to be found? So Cindy says After great rain, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you're meaning here, Cindy. After great rain, a remedies that has been. Oh, okay. So I guess more tombs would have been raided in years where people were economically in need, right? So if your crops had failed or if the economy in Egypt wasn't very good, then maybe it was more tempting to rob a tomb. Yeah. What else here? Oh yeah, we found out that rain revealed graves, right? So if water was pooling up in one place in the desert, but it wasn't really pooling up in another place, that told you that the water was draining down into something underground, and you might have a tomb there, right? What else? What else? What else? What else? Nothing else? And those things were stolen and then they were sold, right? People didn't keep them for themselves; they sold them, and of course, that sort of tomb raiding went all the way through history, and so lots of those tombs were robbed thousands of years ago. So maybe a short time after they were originally buried, but people continued to look for tombs and try to find the artifacts, particularly in the 18 and 1900s. There's a lot of interest in Egypt and Orientalism, and lots of people, particularly British and Western European scholars, I'm going to say, quote unquote, came to Egypt looking for tombs and riches and things like that they would either sell to museums or sell to collectors. And so lots of people were coming to Egypt in the 18 and 1900s, doing archaeology, quote unquote, but really it was more tomb raiding because they were kind of interested in it or they were there for the money. Okay, so let's leave that video behind. I hope it was interesting for you. I find this stuff really super interesting, and so I could spend more time on it, but we won't, because we gotta move on. So I'm just gonna skip ahead here a little bit. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Egyptian art, because we've seen actually quite a bit of it already in videos and in pictures. So the Egyptians were very prolific artists, and so we see lots of paintings on the walls of tombs and on the side of temples. We see sculpture, we see architecture, and we see these artistic things produced for really thousands of years. And so Egypt has a very long history of art. What was the last question I asked you? It was that was the best one. Okay, thanks for reminding me, Eliana. Let me ask you that one then. Why do you think people are so intrigued with ancient Egypt? Because I certainly am. And this may be a difficult question to ask if this topic is not that interesting for you. But why do you think people are so interested in ancient Egypt and really have been for hundreds and hundreds of years? What's so interesting or attractive about this particular civilization? Karen says it looks modern. Yeah. So some of the temples and buildings that we see the Egyptians create are, again, thousands of years old and are created without any sort of machines or mechanical labor, and yet they are fantastically sturdy, modern looking buildings, right? Which is astounding, right? Various theories. I might need a little more there, Cindy. I'm not really sure what you mean by that. Sam said because it's very, very, very old. Yeah, maybe that's part of it, right? It is very. Part of the interesting thing about ancient Egypt is that it is ancient, right? Is that it's thousands. This is a civilization that's thousands of years old. Ayana says because they cures to disease and maybe they want to see how they lived before or without modern technology. Yeah. So these are people that are, the Egyptians were just like us. They were genetically like us, so they had all of the same thoughts and feelings and intelligence as we do. But of course, they were living in a very different world, right? A world with different types of technology, different ways of living, different spiritual beliefs. And so, they're very similar to us, but they're also very different as well. What do you think? Other thoughts? Why is this so interesting? Yeah, certainly their culture is something that people find intriguing, right? People are very interested not only in the things that they built, but also their cultural ideas, right? Their religion, their spirituality, their politics, all of those things are of interest to people, right? Yeah, people are, it's ancient, it's very old, and people are curious about this culture that was able to build such amazing things, right? And the pyramid at Giza, the Great Pyramid, is one of the wonders of the ancient world, and really the only one that's still standing, which is incredible, right? That building is 5,000 years old, and it's incredible because really almost none of the buildings that we build today will last that long, right? We don't build things like that anymore, and so we have this incredible piece of architecture that's thousands and thousands of years old. People are intrigued because there's a lot of mysteries and it's extremely developed and modern. Yeah, so there is kind of a mystery to the Egyptians, right? Because they've, on the one hand, they've left so much behind in terms of their writing, in terms of their art, in terms of their architecture, and yet they themselves, the Egyptians, are kind of gone, right? And so they've kind of left this huge amount of information behind for us, but they've kind of vanished into history. And of course, some of the descendants of ancient Egyptians are still, can still be found in Egypt today. But they are kind of mysterious in that way, right? Because, if you think of China, China has a very long history, right? It's a very ancient civilization, but China as sort of a culture and an ethnicity still exists, right? China is still, there's still a historical continuity between ancient China and modern China, but the Egyptians kind of created an ancient world, but then kind of disappeared, right? And so that's very kind of mysterious, I think. But again, their technology and their artwork are quite compelling. And Karen says, many ancient societies didn't develop quite to that degree. The Egyptian society is very complicated and very complex, and fortunately, they wrote all kinds of things down, and fortunately, we can actually read that writing, and so we can actually understand the complexity of that society because the writing gives us a window into it, right? We're able to understand the kind of things that they were thinking and saying and feeling because they wrote it down, right? And because we can read those things. Super interesting. Okay, artwork. So the Egyptians are artists, and they use their artistic skills in painting and sculpture, and music, although music doesn't really preserve, all throughout their thousands of years history. And much of the Egyptian art that we had is religiously themed, and so it comes to us from tombs, or it comes to us from religious monuments of some sort. And so again, there's a lot of emphasis on life after death when we look at ancient Egyptian art. One of the things that we should know about Egyptian art is that it was very stylized and very symbolic. Okay, what do I mean by stylized? Well, I mean that the things that were depicted in ancient Egyptian art are not perfectly true to reality. Okay, so if you think of, let's think of Homer Simpson, right? We've all seen The Simpsons. We know Homer Simpson. Homer is a stylized human, right? When you see him on the show, you know he's supposed to be a human being. You know that's who Homer Simpson is, but he doesn't look realistic, right? He doesn't look like any human that's walking around. And so that's what I mean by stylized. He's obviously human, but he's not perfectly realistic. He's not perfectly anatomically correct. He's a representation of a human. And so Egyptian art is kind of like this as well. It's very stylized, but it's also very symbolic. Okay, so there's lots of symbols used in Egyptian art. The other thing that's very interesting is that their art style remains very consistent for 3,000 years at least. So when we see kind of the first kinds of paintings and sculptures on tombs in ancient Egypt 5,000 years ago, if you jump forward to 3,000 years ago, you see that the art style hasn't really changed very much in 1,000 or 2,000 years, which is pretty remarkable, right? Lots of, in terms of the modern world, our artistic style kind of evolves through time, and it becomes, based on various fashions. But Egyptian art stays very, very consistent. And part of the reason for that is because of its religious importance. And religion isn't something that kind of changes with fad and fashion. Religion is something that stays consistent. And so because their art was so religious, it stayed very consistent as well. And it doesn't change very much throughout thousands of years. So here, we've seen this image before, I know. This is a piece of the Book of the Dead. And I want to point out a few things to you, okay? The first thing I want to point out is the size of these figures, okay? Now, you can see here that the pharaoh is represented by Horus. And so the pharaoh is kind of standing in the middle of this picture here. You can see he's wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, like we talked about. He's kind of got a falcon head here, and he's standing, and he's pretty much the height of the entire image, right? But here, if you look in the bottom left, you see that whole weighing of the heart scene. And so Anubis is there, and the crocodile monster is there, and Tot is there, but they're all like half as tall as the pharaoh is. And so does that mean that Anubis is a god that's about this high? No. The Egyptians changed the size of figures depending on how important they were to the scene. And so again, that's part of this artwork not being entirely realistic, because human figures are not created in a size that represents their actual true size. The size has to do with how important they are in the scene. And so again, when you go back here, you can see people are all different sizes, but it has to do more with their importance in the scene and not their actual real life size. The other thing you'll notice too is that ancient Egyptian figures kind of stand in a very strange fashion. Okay, so if you look at the central figure here, the pharaoh, he's kind of standing with his feet going in one direction, right? So his feet are going one way, and his kind of legs and his waist area are going in the same direction. But then his chest is not sideways. His chest is straight, right? And his arms are kind of turned sideways as well, and his hands are out, and his head is to the side. And so I'm not going to do it on camera here, but nobody stands that way, right? Nobody stands with their feet pointing this way and their body pointing this way and their arms like this and their head like, it's a very non-natural posture, right? But you see really all Egyptian figures standing in this way. You see them with their feet going one way, their legs going one way, their body going this way, their arms stretched out, and their head turned one way or the other, right? Nobody stands like that in real life, but in ancient Egyptian art, you can see that. Happening. It's very distinctive, and it's very kind of odd as well at the same time. I wanted to show you this because again, we see that the body posture is kind of a little bit strange, but also look at the hands. The pharaoh here in the middle has kind of wet noodle hands, and they're kind of hanging there, and they're kind of curved in a very unnatural way, right? So again, the humans here are stylized, right? They're not exact representations of accuracy. The other thing I want you to notice here is look at the woman, which I believe is the wife of the pharaoh here. She's on the far right, and then the pharaoh's in the middle. Anubis is out on the left. The pharaoh and his wife here, they appear to have different skin tones. So what do you think that means? Or why do you think they're painted slightly different colors? So you'll see Anubis there. Anubis has a certain skin color. The pharaoh has similar skin color, but his wife has a lighter skin tone. Why do you think that is? Why do you think Pharaoh's wife, why do you think this woman has a lighter skin tone? Okay, maybe she's not originally from Egypt, right? Maybe she's a different ethnicity, or is from a different part of the world. Maybe. And what else do you think? Why might someone have lighter skin and one have darker skin? Okay, let me help you out here. So part of what's happening here in terms of different skin tones, yes, it could definitely be different ethnicities. And there definitely is, there's a difference in gender for sure, Ella. And so a lot of times when you see ancient Egyptian men and women painted, you'll see men are painted darker and women are painted lighter. And so, yeah, maybe she never got to go out of her house into the heat. Yeah. So men were primarily, their work took them out of the house. And so they were in the fields all day. They were farming, or they were soldiers, or they were craftsmen working away. They were kind of doing stuff outside the home. Women were more often found inside the home, raising kids and preparing food and things like that. And so who gets a darker tan? Who's been out in the sun more? Men, right? Women are lighter skinned because they're staying inside more often. And so you can see that happening here, where she's a slightly lighter color than him. And again, that has to do with probably some gender differences that you see in ancient Egyptian society, and it's reproduced in their art, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, that was good. You can see it even more clearly here, right? Look at these two. There's two Egyptian men, one on either side of this, one on either side here, and then his wife, the guy on the left, there's his wife behind him, and you can see that she's pretty clearly a different color from him, right? And again, that has to do with gender roles, and it has to do with who's outside all the time and who's not outside all the time. And again, you can see the real difference in size of figures, right? So this in no way looks natural with all these little people in the middle. You know, these aren't little people. They're just depicted that way to sort of transmit information to you. And again, you can see the very kind of unnatural body posture that these Egyptians are standing in. Nobody in real life stands like this, right? This is very bizarre, but it's part of Egyptian art. Another version of the Book of the Dead, again, you can see this very common scene of the weighing of the heart, and you can see Anubis bringing the dead person into the presence of Osiris. Osiris and Isis are on the far right, and he's going to have his heart weighed, and then if he's successful, then he will move on and be presented to Osiris to enter the next world. So you can also see another part of Egyptian art here, in that some of the figures are represented twice, and so it's almost like a comic strip, but there's not different, but they're not separated out like comic drawings are. And so you can see the dead person here on the far left, but the dead person is also kind of in the middle of the picture as well, because he's already successfully had his heart weighed, and now he's going to get to meet Osiris. And so there's kind of that progression of time shown here too. Sometimes you see some of these figures carved as well, so they can be carved into the stone, or they can be carved in relief like this one. And again, you can see a lot of the things that we already saw, right? The really weird body posture is still present here in the carving. If you look at sculpture, here we have three pharaohs, okay? And I'm not sure, I don't seem to recall who these pharaohs are, but three different pharaohs of Egypt from different times. And so maybe not so much the one in the bottom right, but for the other two, you'll see that again, they look very stylized, right? They don't really look like real people. Especially if you look at the pharaoh on the top right. He doesn't quite look like someone that you wouldn't recognize him on the street, right? Nobody quite looks that way. Same thing with the one on the left. Nobody looks that way. The one in the bottom right is a little more naturalistic. It feels like you might recognize him based on his features, but lots of other pharaohs are portrayed in ways that are not realistic. It doesn't really look like the sculpture doesn't really reflect what they look like. It's more, you know, again, a stylized version of who they are. Here's a sculpture of Khafre. He's the son of Khufu, and so he built the second pyramid in line, but beside the Great Pyramid. And so here he is, he's pharaoh, he's standing there with his wife. And again, this is a very odd way to stand, right? If you think about real people, nobody stands this way, right? Nobody, it's very stiff, it's very strange. His wife is kind of holding her husband in a very, yes, they're catfishing you a little bit. Um, yeah, they're definitely catfishing you, Karen. That's good. That's exactly what's happening. Um, yeah, so we have really stylized versions of how these people look, but also like a really odd posture. And so lots of pharaohs are posed this way, or lots of people are posed this way, standing there with their left foot forward. But again, their legs are really, or their arms are like straight down at their sides. His wife is kind of holding on to him in a very strange way. And so it just doesn't look natural. It doesn't look realistic at all. Contrast that to this. Contrast that to a Renaissance Michelangelo sculpture. This looks really realistic, right? There's a lot of movement, even though it's kind of a fantastic scene. There's these serpents that are trying to attack this biblical figure. It looks very realistic, right? It looks like a real person, and the pose, the sort of body posture that this person is in, or that these three individuals are in, is also very natural. You could imagine a human being posed in that way. But again, contrast it to Egypt, where this is just not natural at all. Nobody stands this way. So there were some changes to Egyptian art, but I think what we should do, we've been working hard here for a bit. Let's take a little break, and we'll come back and we'll kind of wrap up the discussion of this artwork. Okay, so take a break, stretch your legs, and I'll see you in just a little bit. Okay. Okay, people, and we're back. So we've been looking at ancient Egyptian art, and some of the things that are important or characteristic about it is A, the fact that it is very consistent for thousands of years. Um, B, it is very stylized, and so humans don't look like anatomically correct humans, and they kind of stand in weird ways. Um, in terms of sculpture, many Egyptian sculptures are kind of very unnatural in the way they stand. They kind of stand very rigid with their arms down and their left foot forward. Um, as Karen mentioned, they're kind of catfishing us a little bit. Um, their features have been they've used a filter of some sort, and so they're kind of a little more idealized and a little more perfect than probably their real faces were. Um, and then we saw that the Egyptians kind of manipulated the size of individuals as well. And so if a certain person wasn't very important in the scene, yeah, they were shown as small, even though, realistically they wouldn't have been, a foot tall or 2 feet tall. It just has to do with how important they are in the scene. And we saw a bit of a gender difference as well. And we said that because women are inside more often, their skin is portrayed as lighter in color, and guys are portrayed with darker skin. Now, even though Egyptian art was very, very consistent and changed very little over thousands of years, we did see some changes, and particularly during the period of the pharaoh Akhenaten. And I think they mentioned him in the book, in the textbook, and I think they mentioned him in the video as well. And so, toward the end of the 18th dynasty, so this is after Ramses II, we get a pharaoh who actually manages to convert the Egyptian state, the Egyptian religion, to monotheism. And so we know that the Egyptians are polytheistic, they have more than one god. But Akhenaten changed the state religion to monotheism, to that of a single god. And so the reason for this seems to have been that the priests of Amun or Amun-Ra, who we've talked about, had become increasingly powerful, and they were kind of pushing the pharaoh around, I guess, politically speaking. And so when this pharaoh here, Amenhotep, comes to the throne, when he becomes pharaoh, notice that he's got Amun in his name, right? Amenhotep. So he's connected with Amun or Amun-Ra. When he becomes pharaoh, he decides that he's going to break away from the priests by basically changing the state religion and making himself the head of religion in Egypt. And so he changes the state's religion to the worship of Aten. And Aten is kind of the sun itself, the literal sun. And he sort of proclaims himself as the head of religion in Egypt. And so he changes his name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten. And so you can see Aten is in his name now. He sets up a new capital in a different place. And again, he starts building temples to Aten. And he basically starts a whole new way of religious life for the Egyptians. You can only imagine, of course, that this would have been very disruptive to the Egyptians, right? They've been practicing their religion for thousands of years, and then we get a pharaoh who says, forget all that stuff, worship this guy instead. And for those of us who are religious, try to imagine a religious leader coming to power, whether it's an imam or Aga Khan or a pope or the Dalai Lama or whoever you might see as the leader of a religion or a leader of spirituality. This person coming into power and saying, oh yeah, all that stuff, that's all wrong. We're going to worship this thing instead. You can only imagine that it was highly disruptive and angering and upsetting for the Egyptians. But of course, Akhenaten did it anyway. And so he changed the state religion, built himself a new capital. Um, it may have looked something like this. This is an artist's rendition of what the city might have looked like. This is kind of what it looks like today. There's not too much left. We'll get to that in a second. But one of the interesting things here about the Akhenaten period is not only that we have a significant religious change from polytheism to monotheism, but we have a pretty significant change in Egyptian art for the first time in thousands of years. And so if you look at this figure here, you'll see this is Akhenaten and his wife, and Akhenaten's in the middle there, and he's worshiping Aten. He's worshiping the sun disk itself. And so he's kind of standing there giving some sort of offering to the god, an offering to the sun. But look at how he's drawn. His body posture is similar, but he's kind of more curvy, right? He's a little more naturalistic. His face looks a little bit different too. His face is a little bit elongated as well, and he's kind of got a bigger nose. You can see that a little bit more here. Here's a relief carving of Akhenaten. And again, this is a very different look from the pharaohs that we saw before, right? The pharaohs before all kind of looked, they were all going through the same filter, right? The same Instagram or Snapchat filter. But Akhenaten's using a different filter, right? He looks, I don't know about more naturalistic, but he certainly looks different, right? He's got really big lips. He's got kind of a big chin, bigger eyes. He's kind of more curvy all around, right? And you can see this even in sculptures. And so he looks quite a bit different from the sculptures of Pharaoh that we saw before. Again, he's kind of curvy. He's almost a little bit feminine in a way. But a very different artistic style, right? A very different look for Egyptian art. This is supposed to be, I believe, Akhenaten's wife, Nefertiti. And again, you can see the realism here, right? This actually looks like a human woman, right? You could imagine that if you saw this picture, if you saw this sculpture of her, this bust of her, that you would actually recognize her in real life. If she was walking down the street, you would recognize her. She looks a bit like a supermodel, actually, but she's very naturalistic, right? Much more naturalistic than some of the other sculptures we saw. And here, look at this carving as well. And so look how kind of interesting and strange these two characters look, right? They're stylized again. They don't look perfectly like real humans, but they're kind of curvy, right? And if you look, Akhenaten's got a bit of a belly, it looks like, too. All the other pharaohs had, probably 6 and 8 packs. They had really good ab muscles, but Akhenaten's shown with a bit of a belly, and he's kind of curvy, and he's got, a big nose and big lips. But also very interesting about this scene is not only the shape of the figures, but it's what these two are doing. And so this is Akhenaten and his wife, and they're sitting there playing with their children. This is something you almost never see in the art of the pharaohs. So normally when you see pharaohs depicted, they're depicted as gods, right? They're standing there very stern, or they're giving praise to the gods, or they're killing their enemies, or they're hunting for lions or something like this. And so you always see pharaohs sort of performing their duties as pharaoh, whether they're doing brave things, or whether they're worshiping the gods, or whether they're killing their enemies. Whatever they're doing, you see them in their official functions. But you don't see pharaohs doing regular day stuff. You don't see them kissing their wife or playing with their kids. But here with Akhenaten, you do see that, right? Here he is with his wife, and his wife's got maybe their little daughter sitting on her knee. That's really cute. And then Akhenaten's got his son in his arms, right? And he's giving him a little kiss. And so very naturalistic, very sweet. But again, you don't see that. You don't see that with regular Egyptian art. And so that was a very strange, not strange, but a very different thing for Egyptian art during this period. So again, we see representations of animals and plants are very naturalistic. We see people who are a little more loose in how they're posed. They seem to have some kind of sense of movement. And so you can see that here, right? You can see that, you can see that, they're kind of relaxing, and this little girl, the little baby girl, is on her mom's knee, and she's pointing at dad, and dad's got this little boy in his arms. And so you can almost imagine this scene happening. You can imagine these people moving around and playing out this scene, right? Again, we've got lots of stylization still, but it's a different type of stylization. And so Akhenaten and his wife and his children tend to have really kind of longer heads and sort of a bit of a belly or stomach. They're kind of curvy, they're kind of hippie in a way that earlier Egyptians aren't drawn. So really a different art style. Here's another one. This is Akhenaten's nephew, I think, Tutankhamun. And so if you know anything about Tutankhamun, or King Tut as he is commonly known, he's very famous because his mostly intact tomb is discovered in the Valley of the Kings in 1922. But here he is as a young man, and you can see he's still drawn in this kind of very curvy, naturalistic style. And here's Tutankhamun's wife. He's actually Tutankhaten at the moment here, and his girlfriend is giving him flowers, which is kind of cute, right? And so here we are, two kids sitting there, very naturalistic. Okay, so Akhenaten is going to die, though, unfortunately. I don't know, not unfortunately, but he dies eventually. And when he does, things revert back to the way they are, or the way they were, very quickly. And so Akhenaten had chosen a successor pharaoh who would continue on with the state religion and the worship of Aten, the sun's disk. But as soon as he died, they got rid of that guy, and they put Tutankhamun on the throne. And so Tutankhamun is actually very young when he comes to the throne. I think he's about 10 years old. And they sort of use this boy king. They sit him on the throne, and then all of the officials around him revert Egypt back to the way it was. And so the art style switches back to the way it was. The polytheistic religion returns. They abandon the new capital city that he created at El Amarna, and they return the capital to Thebes. They chisel all of Akhenaten's name off of monuments, and he's referred to as the criminal Akhenaten. And so you can kind of see how conservative the Egyptians were. And so again, this, people were, had been worshiping and performing their religion in a certain way for thousands of years. And then this guy shows up and changes everything. And so when he dies, everybody is very eager to push his successor aside and switch things back to the way they were, which is exactly what they do. And so again, his city is destroyed, and people try to forget about him as quickly as they possibly can. Okay, now that's going to bring us basically to the end of ancient Egypt. And so there are some things I'd like to talk about here, but I think what I will do instead is I'll leave those for Monday, because I do want to talk about how all those different things that we've studied and kind of the most important things we've pulled out of this unit on Egypt and Mesopotamia, how they connect to each other, because that's an important thing that we want to do. We don't just want to learn about what cultures are like, but we want to know how different parts of culture are connected to each other, and how we can sort of understand one culture by comparing it to another. And so that's a bit of a bigger discussion, and so I would like to get into that more on Monday. What I would like to remind you of at the moment is we will have an oral quiz on Monday, and it'll be on classes 10 to 16. All the lecture slides are posted, but I'll make sure that they're posted. And as usual, I'll open a meeting in Microsoft Teams, and you'll come in one at a time, and I'll ask you a question or two. So make sure that you're camera ready for Monday morning, and make sure you're studied and ready to go. I'll also remind you about the little micro paper that I want you to do. That's posted on Student Portal and on Microsoft Teams. On the weekend, I'll post a bit of a marking guide, so that might help you to write this thing. And that'll be due next Friday. That'll be due a week from today. So on the weekend, if you want to dig into that, that might be a good idea. Other than that, are there any questions that you might have for me, or things you want to say, or anything? I'm here to answer all of your questions, to explain things. Ask away. Are you good? Are you not good? Are you confused about something? Are you, what do you think? What do you think? Thanks for the catfishing thing, by the way, Karen. I wish I would have thought of that. That's pretty good. I wish I would have thought of that. Okay, so Ella's good. Casey, no questions. Adalbert's cool. I know you're cool. Adalbert, come on. Okay, Pika's good. Mashid is good. Okay, so again, Michael's good. Thanks. You're welcome, Michael. So yeah, on Monday we'll do the quiz. That'll probably take us most of the class, to be honest with you. And then on Tuesday we will wrap up ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. We'll move on to the next module, which is India. Karen's good. Okay. So Eliana's okays. Ying is good. It's too bad that emoji doesn't show up. I know it looks weird, but Carmen's good. Okay, so it looks like everyone's good. Again, if you have questions, you can always contact me by email or on Microsoft Teams, and I'll respond to you as soon as I can. Other than that, I think I might leave it there. I hope you all have a lovely weekend. Try to get some sleep and enjoy yourselves a little bit. The quiz, Cindy, on Monday is on the material from classes 10 to 16. 10 to 16. Hey, there's Sabrina. Hi, Sabrina. Okay, so I'll leave it there. Quiz Monday, classes 10 to 16. Try to do some work on your little micro paper assignment, which is on Student Portal and Microsoft Teams over the weekend if you want. That might help you get ahead. And yeah, I'll leave it there, okay? So have a good weekend, guys, and thanks for being here and participating, and I will see you on Monday, okay? So bye.